And from your perspective, then, let's say, like, when you're getting new clients coming to you who actually have a background in trying to train for powerlifting or trying to train for maximal strength, what would you say are some of the most common mistakes that you see people making in their programming?
Probably would be going too heavy too often,
Yeah.
and not spending enough time like keeping the RPEs or the intensities a little bit lower. Um, and then potentially as well, just like operating with the same kind of set structure for too long. Like I think like there's kind of merit in when you're training for something like hypertrophy to kind of keep going with a program until your progress stops in a sense. Whereas with training, with training for strength, like sometimes the higher degree or higher degree of variability in a program can help because it stops you from going towards those higher intensities
Mm.
too often. And like one thing, it's the difference almost between training for hypertrophy and strength, in the sense that when you're training for hypertrophy, like most of the time you're trying to push towards the kind of degree of kind of closer proximities to failure to kind of get the adaptations that you want. Whereas with strength, the more often you do that, you just increase fatigue, especially on the likes of squat, bench, and deadlift, because they can incur a lot of fatigue, as you just mentioned there. Do that on machine, no problem. Do it on a squat or deadlift, and like yeah, you could be fried for the rest of the session. And then that might just mean that you need to deload more often. When you're deloading, you're not training, you're not accumulating train volume, and you're probably not going to be making the adaptations that you want. So that would probably be one thing I see people do. Another thing would be, depending on the person, not having the confidence to go towards heavy weights as well.
Mm.
Because that can definitely be a barrier. Now, previously, like years ago, that would have been a barrier to me. Like I would perceive in my own head that I could not lift certain weights, and it would stop me going towards them. And anytime I got towards them, I'd get my own head about lifting that weight, and the anxiety of even performing the session will get to me too much, and I might not necessarily load the bar. Um, Other things would be training with people as well who have a similar goal to yourself. I do think training with people who are looking to train for strength too can really help, because it's like an accountability buddy. Like while you may have a coach, your coach might only see your videos like once a week or whatever. Whereas if you're training with somebody in person, like, well, one, you can keep each other accountable to, yes, you are hitting the targets that you should be hitting with the sufficient degree of intensity. Your technique is obviously going to be improved as well if somebody's there keeping an eye on you. So those would be kind of things that I'd kind of see often with people who are just getting into strength training, or who have been doing strength training for a while, and kind of common mistakes I might see them do.
Perfect. And I think I've observed all of those myself as well. I'm just trying to think, is there anything else? Um, Potentially, you might have said this along the way, but I think a lack of, like, we already mentioned, a lack of variation, let's say in intensity ranges and stuff, but also a lack of variation in exercise selection, because I suppose while specificity is so incredibly important, as you mentioned previously in the conversation, um, if you're overly specific all of the time, that becomes very stale. It probably increases risk of injury. It probably increases risk of training burnout to some degree as well, because of a lack of interest. But you'll have guys who they do low bar squat in competition, and that's the only squat variation they ever train as a result. They never do any front squats, they never do any high bar squats. That's all they train. And that might be 2, 3 times a week for years on end. And what happens then very often, and I see a lot of this because I tend to work with people who are crippled already. What tends to happen is you get a bit of a niggling injury, like maybe it's your groin or it's your low back or something, and you still don't vary
Yeah.
your exercise selection at all. You just keep persisting with that exercise, even though it's aggravating it. Whereas it could be the case that if you were to just swap for a front squat for a certain period of time, would take a bit of load off the back or the hip, and that you were able to continue developing the musculature, albeit in a less specific manner, but you're able to keep on training and you're not going to continue
Mhm.
aggravating that injury. That's one of the things I see very frequently as a mistake, because I think people worry that, or if I'm not training the specific lifts all of the time, that I'm not going to be contributing to getting stronger in them. But you are, because you can still train the same muscles, you can still build the same muscles. And the movement patterns are so similar in the grand scheme of things. It's just that there's a difference when it comes to the nitty gritty of the powerlifting competition. And I think that comes back as well to what we said previously, where a peaking block is not necessarily your entire year of training. So I imagine that in your own training, and this is how I would typically program for people, would be that variation is basically inversely proportional to the time from competition. So if we're 6 months out from competition, you can do more variation there. That's no problem at all. If you're a month out from competition, it's not the time for variation, it's the time for specificity. It's the same with martial arts. Like Paddy and I both do jiu-jitsu. Well, so does Dean, so does Brian. You and Nicola are going to need to jump on the train. But no, so we do jiu-jitsu, and one of the things in jiu-jitsu is that there's basically an infinite amount of different types of guard you could play, submission attempts you could play, general styles that you could attempt. And it's really nice to play around with all that stuff. But when it comes to competition, what people are generally trying to do is develop some sort of game plan so that they know that if this happens, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this. Because if you have too many choices, then you're just not really developing any specific characteristics. So that's what you're trying to prioritize when it's close to competition. A field sports example, again, would be like we coach a lot of GA athletes, and typically as we approach the season, and it's particularly the most intense period of the season, we're doing a lot more like high velocity repeated sprint work, on the pitch, specific to the sport. We're not trying to build loads of muscle or lay down our aerobic base at that point. That should be done. Now is the time to exploit those sport specific characteristics. So these parallels can be drawn across all different sports. And it comes back to that point that powerlifting is a sport. So if you're going to be competing, you need to specify for that sport closer to that time. And one more thing to add there as well is that I know that it's probably the term doesn't get used too much anymore, but over the last probably decade, maybe 15 years, a lot of the natural bodybuilding and natural powerlifting worlds kind of crossed over. And one of the things that happened then was everyone was into power building and trying to do both, where they're trying to do bodybuilding and they're trying to do powerlifting. And the way that it often manifests is that what people effectively do is they start their workout with a powerlifting like program. Like let's say they do 7 sets of 3 on squat, but then they still do like the full hypertrophy program. So they still then do their 5 sets of 15 on the leg press and 4 sets of 20 on the Bulgarian split squat, and so on and so on. And I imagine that in your own programming, you might be a little bit closer to that when you're far out from competition. But if you're a week out from competition, 2 weeks out, 4 weeks out from competition, you're not going to be wasting all your resources on split squats and leg presses and leg extensions, etc., when it could be diverted to the specific lifts. Would that be correct?
Oh yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, like once you're not in prep for a competition, the rest of that time is essentially trying to build your body in a sense so that it can express as much strength as possible. Like one big component of strength is like muscle mass. Like it's not like a one-to-one relationship. Like, growing more muscle doesn't mean you necessarily grow more strength. It just kind of allows for potentially more strength potential. And you see that with as you go up higher and higher and higher in weight class and powerlifting, strength typically tends to increase. So in your kind of building phases, you are looking to add in some variation, as you just mentioned there. One for variety, longevity, injury risk reduction, and just so potentially you're training through weak points too. And then you would also have like more kind of like bodybuilding work or accessories, as some people call them, but I don't really like to call them accessories as well, because people kind of diminish their actual need to actually do them as well.
It's easy to skip those things. They're just viewed as they're accessories, optional.
Whereas it's still important, because even when it comes to doing like your competition squat, your deadlift or bench, like one of your main focuses there is like, move that weight from A to B as explosively as possible. Whereas like when you're more so doing your hypertrophy based exercises, like you're more so focused not necessarily on the weight, but more so like what your muscle is doing, and like actually trying to increase like the size of your quads or your back, your chest, or whatever. So then as you do come into your peaking phase, like, you can start to strip out the likes of your accessories, or maybe you just decrease the intensity that you do them at. Maybe you keep them in because you don't want to take them out completely, but you do definitely scale them back down in terms of intensity. So as opposed to where you would have been maybe pushing like the reps in reserve from like maybe like 3 to 0 in your kind of building phases, when you come into the peak, you're trying to keep it a good deal away from that, because you don't necessarily want to incur any more fatigue than you would be doing than through your main lifts. And then as you're coming into your peaking phase, like, yeah, typically in the kind of 1 to 2 weeks before competition, 1 week before competition, you're realistically not doing much training at all. And then 2 weeks from training, you're probably just coming in to do your kind of main lifts. Typically that may look like, your last deadlift, your last squat for openers. And yeah, so you wouldn't really be doing much accessories at all.